Hello and welcome to Unit 2. We're looking at Unit 2 in context, or violence at the quote-unquote meso level. So this week we'll get an introduction to violence at the meso level, including a definition of what this level is. So we've moved up from micro onto meso. Like Unit 1, feel free to take a pause as you need to. Otherwise, let's get started. So from before, if you remember, violence is the whole or partial negation of agency through force. Now again, force does not always mean physical, and this agency or autonomy is removed through dehumanization, or viewing somebody as less than human or as not human, and demonization, or viewing somebody as scary or savage or thuggish or etc. Violence has increased as the West has colonized. And violence is about power. Those who have power want to keep it. Those who don't have power want to get it. And violence may be viewed as an acceptable way of obtaining or maintaining power, depending on who is committing it. Violence creates a dichotomy of us versus them. So if you remember from Unit 1, who is commonly in the us group and in the them group in this country, it overlaps usually with race, with ethnicity, with gender, with ability status, with sexuality, etc. And our perception of violence is context dependent. So we perceive violence as justified or quote-unquote appropriate based on who is committing it and what is being used for. So this overlaps with that us versus them dichotomy. If you remember from Unit 1, violence committed by people of the quote-unquote us group is okay, and violence committed by those in the them group is typically viewed as not okay. So how does this work at the meso level? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what the meso level is. If you remember that this course works with two models, so one of which is this modified Bronfenbrenner model, named after Uri Bronfenbrenner. If you'd like to take a look at the original Bronfenbrenner model, see slide 4 of the Unit 1 and context slides, and you can see how we went from the original one to the modified one that we're using for this course. So if you remember, in Unit 1, we looked at behaviors that mainly occurred in this micro individual level. So for Unit 2, we're going to look at behaviors that mainly occur within a meso or group level. Now, mesosystems, according to Bronfenbrenner, are the interactions between microsystems and exosystems. And so microsystems are those individual level systems, and exosystems are institutional systems. So mesosystems, then, according to Bronfenbrenner, are the interactions between individual level things, such as your school, your church, your family unit, etc., and exosystems, or the institution of the Catholic Church or the institution of the school district. So it'd be you against the school district. Very good example. Now for this course, again, we've simplified things, so keep in mind that we're not using Bronfenbrenner's full system. We're simplifying it for ease of understanding in this course. Mesosystems are in between a person's immediate environment and more distinct or distant structural environments. So mesosystemic behaviors or interactions occur between groups for this course. So micro-level violence occurs between 2 or 3 or 4 individuals, and meso-level violence is violence between 2 or 3 or 4 groups. And so we're moving up from an individual level to more of a group level. Again, this is overly simplified for the ease of understanding. What I really want you to know is micro is at the individual level, meso we're looking at violence on a group, individual or between group level, excuse me. Now you might be asking what's considered a group. How do we know if 3 people isn't a group but 4 people is, right? And that's a great question. It's relatively outside of the realm of this course. We'll go over what specific subtypes of meso-level violence will be covered later, and for this course, let's say group is roughly 4 or more people. There's not really a set definition that I'm going to use, so maybe a group is 3, maybe it's 4, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 10. But 2 I wouldn't consider a group, 3 maybe, 4 or more probably would consider a group at that point. But definitely, when you get up to the 10 or more range, we're going to start looking at sort of group interactions. So if you remember this pyramid from Unit 1, as a reminder, the modified Bronfenbrenner model looks at ecological levels in which behaviors occur, and the violence pyramid looks at specific behaviors. So Pyramid looks behaviors. Bronfenbrenner looks at levels of society that those behaviors occur in. So if you need to take a look at the Unit 1 and context slides for detailed explanations of each tier of the pyramid, go right ahead. If you need that refresher, I don't include them here because they're already somewhere else. But some important things to remember about this pyramid. Lines between the levels are not hard lines. So these lines here, they're solid just for the point of, this graphic being displayed. This is, my limited creative skills in Microsoft PowerPoint, but they're not firm, they're not fast, they're not hard lines. A person's behavior may not be categorized as only one level of the pyramid. So they might not be just discrimination or just attitudes and beliefs. It could be a little bit of both. It's also important to remember that while lower tier behaviors do not always lead to upper tier behaviors, so while having shitty attitudes and beliefs might not lead to violent acts, it doesn't always. A person could have shitty attitudes and never act on them. Upper tier behaviors almost always occur because these lower tier behaviors were okayed. So, if somebody has shitty attitudes and they don't commit an act of violence, all right. If somebody commits a violent act, there's a good chance they have those attitudes and beliefs that were viewed as okay by the rest of society and allowed them to continue. So in Unit 2, we're going to take a look at some of these middle tiers, acts of prejudice, discrimination, and explicitly violent acts. Now remember that these middle acts are still supported by attitudes and beliefs down here, much like the walls of a house are supported by its foundation. So we're not explicitly looking at attitudes anymore for this unit or for Unit 3, but as we move up in the pyramid, remember that those higher acts are still supported by the lower acts. And I know I'm sounding repetitive at this point, but it is an important concept I want to get across for you. So I can hear people saying, but wait, aren't we an egalitarian society? Why do we need to talk about violence between groups? You might have heard we live in a quote-unquote post-racial society, or we're colorblind, or et cetera, et cetera. So many people are purported to be colorblind, so they don't see color. And so because they don't see color, race no longer matters, so differences between races don't exist, and therefore racial conflict is no longer an issue. So we can apply this ideology to other groups as well, such as LGBT folks or people with disabilities. So you can be like, well, I don't see sexuality. We're all one human race, and love is love, and la da da da. Or with people with disabilities, well, I don't see you as a disabled person. I see you as, just a person, or as an inspiration, or what have you. Well, while the idea of living in a quote-unquote blind society is a possibly pleasant one, we don't see people for their race or their disability status or their sexuality or their gender identity or any other sort of identity marker, a lot of critics argue that this idea of color blindness or other quote-unquote blindness is used to argue that race doesn't really matter. And so the consequence of that is that current racial or LGBT or disability or gender issues are ignored. So I have an example in the slide notes. So with the election of President Barack Obama, a lot of people believed that we entered a post-racial society. And in this belief, race did not matter, and people of all races are now equal because we elected a black president, so therefore, black people are now equal to white people. We don't live in a racial society anymore. We're colorblind. Race doesn't matter. We're all the human race. And so people of color then should no longer bring attention to issues in their communities because we're no longer a racist society. Clearly, we're still a very racist society. There are still many issues in many communities of color that are being unaddressed, and part of it stems from people saying, well, we elected a black president, so what more do you want? We're already an equal society. So this blindness then becomes an issue. So I'll tell you more about why this matters as we move through this, but keep in mind that, not acknowledging differences can be just as much of an issue as raising conflict because of differences. So we want to talk about group differences and group conflict throughout this unit. I'm not going to click on this video because it'd be a video within a video and it'd be weird. So this video provides a good overview of intergroup conflict, which is what we're going to talk about now in the next slide. So I want you to take time to watch it fully. Obviously, I'm skipping over it now. This video can also be found within the course YouTube playlist. If it isn't in there already, I'll go ahead and add it later today or tomorrow. So let's take a look at group differences. So I acknowledge that groups are different. Like Black people have different skin color than white people. We're not all the human race, etc., etc. So let's take a look at group differences and conflict from a criminological standpoint, because this is a criminology class. So one criminological theory that lends itself well to explaining mesosystem violence or between group violence is social learning theory. Now, social learning theory was initially developed in sociology. A lot of criminological theories come from sociology and later applied to criminology by Ackers and Burgess. And so in this theory, criminal behavior is learned in social situations through direct and indirect reinforcement and observations, particularly if group norms are conducive to crime or criminogenic. And so in layman's terms, or in plain English, basically, this means that we learn violent behavior by hanging out with people who commit violent behavior. So if one person in a group is violent, it's likely that others are as well. If you remember one of the readings from Unit 1, it said that, if a kid hangs out with bullies, there's a good chance they're going to be a bully as well. And this carries on throughout your life. So if you're hanging out with people who commit violent acts, you learn from them, you view them as a role model or somebody to whose characteristics you might want to live up to or take after. And so then you also will be more likely to commit violent acts as well. There are also a few conflict theories that considers how, group conflict becomes violence between groups, because you can have a conflict with somebody without it becoming a violent thing. But let's consider some of these different perspectives. So before we get into the Marxist feminist things, I want to talk about consensus versus conflict perspectives. So the consensus perspective is agreement on core norms or values, and this holds society together. So a consensus perspective, we all agree that you should stop at a stop sign, or red means stop at a traffic light, or that we face forward in an elevator, or that we, go to work at 9 a.m. and go home at 5 p.m. These are all consensus things. We've generally agreed on it as a society. Now, obviously, different groups have different consensuses. I'm not sure of the plural of that. So, if you are in a different country, maybe people agree to that stop signs aren't necessary, or that you can face sideways in an elevator. It's important to note that not all group norms are universal. Now, conflict, on the other hand, posits that different groups are held together by opposing norms and interests. So, say I'm part of a group that believes that you should stand facing the back of an elevator, and we're held together because we are basically anti-facing forward in an elevator. So we're held together because we're the opposite of the other group, and these are kind of conflicting. Crimes, including violent ones, are thus a result of clashing group norms or interests or the desires. So if I were to talk with somebody who is pro-facing forward in an elevator, we would have a conflict because I'm pro-facing backward in an elevator. Now, this doesn't mean it's going to lead to violence automatically, but again, if I have those attitudes and they're okayed, and, I start committing microaggressions and they're okayed, it might lead to some sort of violent act. I might become angry, while I see somebody facing forward and decide, hey, I'm going to smack you on the head. So you turn around and face backwards, because clearly facing backwards in an elevator is the correct way to do it. Hopefully you can think of other examples of clashing group norms that are potentially more relevant to our current society or more serious in nature. I just used the lighthearted one as an example. So some of these conflict theories then in criminology, including Marxist and feminist and critical criminologies, explain why there is conflict between groups on a larger scale. So I'm not going to spend too much time detailing these criminological theories. It might be worth taking the time to study them on your own, and there are some resources in the slide notes and supplemental links. Social conflict theories also is another thing that you might want to look up as well, although the video in the previous slide does a pretty good job at explaining it. So, This unit will be looking at violence that occurs at a quote-unquote meso level. Violence at this level occurs between groups, particularly those with different interests or norms. So we're looking at this sort of conflict perspective. So if we think back to the violence pyramid, violence is often mid-tier. So this violence between groups can be cultural, it can be religious, it can be racial, etc. What we're going to cover in this specific unit, we're going to look at gangs and organized crime, and we're going to look at the subtle differences between the two. So gangs and organized crime groups are not the same. They're similar, but they're not the same. And so we're going to take a look at the history of those in Chicago, and kind of just the rise of conflicting groups. So I'm going to use it as an example of conflicting groups. And the us versus them categories can be not blurry. They're going to be different than what we've seen in Unit 1 for this subunit, so just be aware of that. And then the following week, we're going to look at other forms of intergroup violence, in particular hate crimes, because hate crimes kind of occur more on a group level. The act itself might be an individual action, but they're occurring as a representative of a group. And we'll go more into that in lecture in the following weeks. So, as always, if you have questions, feel free to send me an email, come and visit my office. Class Activity 4 will be released on Blackboard at 11 a.m. on Thursday, and you'll have until 11 a.m. on Friday to complete it. Like Unit 1, it'll be a blog post of some sort. The exact nature of it might not be the same as Unit 1 in context, but it'll be very similar. As a reminder, next week we'll meet in person. We're going to talk about gangs. It should be a good time. Have an excellent weekend. I'm not sure what the weather's supposed to be like because it's supposed to be hot middle of the week and then cool later this week. So enjoy the weather, whatever it may be. And I will see you all next week.